Why hello you lovely little peppercorns, my name's Noah Lee, and 3D platformers have made quite the comeback in recent years thanks to games like A Hat in Time, Super Mario Odyssey, the Crash and Spyro remakes, and Ukulele, I guess. Of course, this kind of game was a big part of a lot of people's childhood, including my own, and a fundamental part of bringing games out of the second dimension and into the third. They were a large part of gaming's history that allowed us to work out the kinks of moving about in 3D space, and we wouldn't have been able to achieve the heights of gaming we currently find ourselves in without them. However, there was a period of roughly 10 to 15 years or so where this style of game had sort of fallen by the wayside in favor of other genres and mechanics that weren't quite possible in the early days of 3D gaming. Games that were heavy on in-engine cutscenes like Final Fantasy X, sprawling first-person shooters like Halo, and eventually games that featured unique mechanics like Portal that couldn't really be achieved on older hardware, at least not without some clever coding that only modern-day coders looking back on these consoles with many years of tinkering could possibly achieve. Like, have you seen Portal running on the N64? It's pretty dope. During this time, 3D platformers were sort of seen as outdated, as if we had already explored everything that the genre had to offer. Like, we were past that, man. We don't need to go back and explore it. What else is there besides running and jumping and maybe some shooting? Been there, done that, big snore. However, in the past 5 years or so, it seems like the consensus of players has shifted and people now appear to be longing for this type of experience once again. Much of this is probably due to nostalgia for a simpler time, as the people that grew up with this kind of game are now in their 30s and 40s, or maybe just that people who like this sort of game have come to realize that outside of the classics, there really aren't a whole lot of truly great 3D platformers, just a lot of bad to decent ones. And developers have definitely taken notice, pioneering a new era of such a classic genre that has already proven that yeah, there's still a lot we can explore with the genre, actually. Look at Super Mario Odyssey, for example, and how it turned the collecting and sandbox elements of the genre on their heads, completely reinventing a genre that was practically created by the same series to begin with. Or how A Hat in Time further refined the genre's control scheme and precision while applying its mechanics to a variety of different scenarios, showing that the same tight controls can be applied to wildly different contexts and theming while still creating a cohesive whole. Then there are games like 2019's A Short Hike, which isn't really a 3D platformer, but close enough, that explore these tried and true mechanics from a different angle. Like, what if you're a bird that has a limited way to actually glide over and climb things, and the collectibles are feathers which increase your stamina and allow you to explore even more, rather than just being some random MacGuffin that opens a door or something like that. Or how about something like last year's Here Comes Nico that explores a more laid-back 3D platforming experience with a combination of 2D and 3D elements akin to something like Daggerfall. So aesthetically and mechanically, there appears to still be a lot to explore within this genre, but if you notice, pretty much all the games that I just mentioned seem to be cut from the Super Mario 64 / Banjo-Kazooie branch of 3D platforming. But there's another branch of 3D platforming that hasn't been explored as much in recent years that sprouts from the Crash Bandicoot / Spyro the Dragon side of things. Games like Bomberman 64 and Bomberman Hero, Croc, Legend of the Gabbos, Ape Escape, and even later games like Super Mario Land / World. Games that de-emphasize the sandboxy collectathon elements of the genre in favor of a more linear, level-based, action-oriented style. And this is the type of 3D platformer that Frogun is calling back to. Was that enough setup for you? From the look of the game with its 5th console generation aesthetic mixed with its excellent 16-bit soundtrack and pixel art character icons and skyboxes, it's a game that's absolutely trying to evoke a very specific time in video games history, while also breaking new ground with its surprisingly small pool of mechanics. Frogun is a game created by indie developer Raul Martinez Garrido, better known as Molegato, and with the exception of a few things here and there, is a very ambitious game that was created almost entirely by himself. And it's one of the best 3D platformers released in the last 10 years, while looking and sounding like a game that was released over 20 years ago. This style of low-poly graphics is sort of in vogue right now, with many indie developers choosing to model their games in this style, not because they don't have the talent or know-how to create higher poly models, but simply because many have realized that there's a certain charm to this style of graphics that the games from this era of gaming exuded that hasn't really been seen since. Remember how roughly 10 or so years ago the pixel art style became popular once again? Much of this was due to nostalgia, obviously, but also because newer technology allowed for this art style to break new ground as developers were no longer hindered by the technical limitations of the hardware that this style of games originally found themselves on. Shovel Knight, for example, very much looks like an NES game upon a first glance, but clearly it couldn't exist on that hardware as there are too many colors, the game's in widescreen, and there's just a lot more sprites and level assets loaded on the screen at any given time than you would typically find in a game from this third console generation. And because the tools needed to make 3D titles on an indie level was still pretty nascent in the early 2010s, this is the style that a lot of indie developers went with for their games. However, now that 3D game engines and modeling software is readily available and much easier to use than it was 10 years ago, many indie devs are now making the kinds of 3D games that they grew up with, or reimagining newer games with older graphic styles in what are lovingly referred to as demakes. For example, why not take a game like Bloodborne and see if you can get to look and play like a PS1 title? Why not? Seriously, this is so freaking cool. But after a few years of people making videos like this and showing off these kinds of simpler graphics, I'm sure more than a few people have decided to just go ahead and make a game in this style. And Frogun, in my opinion, is one of the first commercially released games that's going to help popularize this graphical style once again. But what I really appreciate about Frogun is that it takes the previously mentioned Shovel Knight approach to its graphics and overall look, and that it wants you to recognize it as a game calling back to an earlier era, but also wants to show you just what can be done within the limitations of this style on modern hardware, because if nothing else, Frogun is a damn good looking game. The colors pop and the 3D models and textures, while simple, are very well done, and the developer has gone to great lengths to use a large color palette on each level while taking the time to properly balance everything so it doesn't turn into a garish assault on the eyes. None of the themes of the levels that you find yourself in are really anything too unique, definitely things you've seen in other games before. Like, you've seen ruins in the sky, you've seen goopy swamps, you've seen snowy mountains and volcano levels and ancient ruins in the dark and rooms filled with treasure, but Frogun's take on these tried and true video game tropes are at least unique. The fire levels, for example, really stuck out to me when I first played them just because the balance of color was so well executed. Something about the yellowish cracks in the dark reddish brown floor and the dark green tiles and the lava flows off in the distance really made this level feel familiar yet fresh, as did its music, which, like a lot of fire levels of the past, feature a lot of chanting of whoos and ha's, but Molegato has also added in some he's for good measure, and I can't help but feel like I'm playing a better version of that one volcano level from The Lion King when I hear it. The music definitely takes a backseat to the visuals, but all the tracks are very well done, and I found myself humming several of the game's tunes during the day while I was trying to get some work done. But the star of the game, for me at least, is its gameplay, and boy oh boy does it deliver in that regard. And also, I mean, it's a video game, so like, if your gameplay sucks, you take on the role of Renata Hops, the daughter of two explorers of some recently discovered ancient ruins or some shit, who is hanging back at a camp while her parents do some archaeology-ing. However, when it's clear that something must be amiss and her parents have yet to return, Renata takes hold of her parents' latest invention, the titular frog gun, a talking frog that's also a gun which allows you to traverse the dangerous ruins and find out what happened to your parents and return them to safety. It's not a deep story, but it is a charming one, and despite the tension of a child having to rescue their parents, it always remains lighthearted and quirky, which I like. Renata and Frogun sort of act as a buddy duo a la Banjo-Kazooie or Ratchet and Clank, and each and every character that you come across through the 6 to 20-ish hours of the game, depending on how much you complete, oozes charm and personality, and you even get a bit more character depth through the journal notes that act as one of the collectibles in each level. In Frogun, you can walk, jump, bounce off of enemies and certain items, and you can use your Frogun's tongue to latch onto things, and that's it. Those are all of your moves for the entire game. However, Ristar proved decades ago that this grabbing mechanic can be very versatile, as you can pick up items and certain enemies and then throw them, or latch onto walls to pull yourself toward them, allowing you to clear larger gaps that you wouldn't be able to jump over. You can pull switches from a distance while standing on a moving platform that's activated by it, or slam face first into certain enemies to deal damage to them, and man, I just realized how sad I am that we'll probably never get a Ristar 3D platformer. But I guess Frogun's close enough, which is probably why I love it so much. And you might think that this small pool of mechanics would get old after a while, but Molegato used this limitation to force himself to get creative and fully explore the limits of the primary mechanic of the Frogun. Much of this is achieved through the game's excellent level design, all of which is constructed in this very blocky manner, but laid out with a lot of twists and turns and verticality that spices up the ultimately linear nature of each level. But the true genius of this level design is how differently the player perceives these levels depending on their skill level and what your goal at that moment in time happens to be. Unlike the more sandboxy, collectathon-focused 3D platformers, Frogun is a game that really wants you to explore its levels through several different lenses, as each level has different challenges that you can either attempt to do all at once or over the course of multiple passes through the level, each of which further completes a fly emblem that acts as the primary MacGuffin of the game. Of these challenges, there's collecting all of the coins in a level, finding the hidden obsidian skull and 2 emerald eyes, beating the level under a certain time limit, and beating the level without dying. And once you beat the game, you'll also unlock the expert time trials that add further flair to your emblems once completed. The coins you collect also have another use besides just completing the emblem, as they also act as currency for the game's shop, which allows you to buy hats and artwork. It's a nice little way to add some more charm to a game that's already chock full of it, but I do have to criticize the game slightly in the fact that even after completing all 42 emblems and going through each level multiple times, I still didn't have enough coins to buy everything from the shop, and since these items are tied directly to the game's completion percentage, and I'm an OCD bastard when it comes to completing 3D platformers, I had to farm coins by replaying levels over and over and over again, and even after about an hour of doing this, I was still about 20,000 coins short of buying everything from the shop, and I just had to say, fuck it. So I didn't technically 100% this game, but as far as I'm concerned, I did. That's a small gripe ultimately, and it is something that a simple update adjusting the prices in the shop could fix really easily, and I hope Molegato does this because right now something like this puts a pretty big damper on the exhilaration of actually mastering this game and completing all of the emblems, especially since this game is absolutely brutal and putting in the effort to get good enough to beat the fucking thing is already asking a lot from the player, but then asking them to spend several hours farming coins in a genre of game that really shouldn't have farming at all is just shit. To be fair, Super Mario Odyssey kind of did the same thing with its myriad of costumes, but at least they weren't tied to the overall progression percentage of the game, so it's a lot easier to forgive. Also, apparently the recent Cow the Kangaroo reboot does this as well, and is this a thing? Why do modern 3D platformers feel the need to force their players to grind for currency in order to unlock everything? Stop it. Anyway, like I said, Frogun's level design is revealed to be even more brilliant once you go back to previously played levels after playing a lot of the later ones. The game is designed in such a way that it gradually teaches you the nuances of using the Frogun and what can be accomplished with it. My experience throughout the entire game was pretty much, this game's about 2 steps away from being bullshit, as it would throw new obstacles that would seem borderline impossible at me, like having to chain several Frogun shots back to clear a gap by bouncing off of tar balls, spiders, or floating skulls, or having to quickly outpace your rival Jake through an increasing number of fireballs, spikes, spinning traps, and enemies in one of the game's several race levels. But then I'd go back and play these levels later on, and the challenges that I was once pulling my hair out in frustration over were now a lot of fun and really not all that difficult after all. The only thing that changed was that I got better at using the primary mechanic. And I think a lot of the frustration of this game boils down to the fact that there's really not a lot of games that feature this mechanic so prominently, so veteran 3D platformers fans like myself can't really rely on 20 plus years of muscle memory and, heaven forbid, actually have to take the time to get good. Gasp. But it's how you perceive the previous levels upon returning with a higher skill level that really blows my mind. My first time through many of the levels, I'd follow the intended path and the level would feel pretty linear overall, but upon returning, I'd start seeing little shortcuts that I could take and opportunities to skip like half of the level. A lot of this was surely intentional, as a lot of the expert time trials can't be completed without practically cheating, but some of this, like this level right here, I was able to complete almost a full minute faster than the expert time limit simply because I had gotten so good at using the Frogun and spotting opportunities to use it. And these are the moments where the game truly shines. The levels are also designed in such a way that over the course of a typical playthrough, the game will begin to teach you these little shortcuts, almost as if the game is encouraging you to cheat. For example, in one of the swamp levels, there are these hollowed out logs that you can walk through and use as bridges, but there's this cutaway section in the middle, and the first time you encounter this level asset, there are some platforms up above it that can only be reached by jumping onto the very thin edge of this cutaway section teaching the player that not only can you do this, but that you might have to in order to complete a level at some point. Or how one of the race levels sets you up for this massive skip by jumping up onto these pots here and then onto this wall, hinting to the player without overtly telling them that there are many options available at their disposal if only they begin to think outside of the box. Overall, this game is a blast and can be really quite challenging at the end. Renata moves pretty slowly in comparison to other 3D platforming stars, so you don't have quite the same sense of flow that Mario or Hat Kid have, but it doesn't really matter because the levels are smaller and much more dense and blockier anyway, so with the addition of the Frogun mechanic, the game really develops its own unique sense of flow, and before long you'll find yourself cruising through a level at a breakneck pace, with the slow movement of Renata forcing the player to examine their surroundings and use the Frogun as much as possible in order to complete the time trials. However, there are a few things that irk me about this game, one of which is that the Frogun, even though it's got an auto-aim system, its controls are a little looser than I would like, and it doesn't always lock onto something when you think it should, or it'll lock onto something when you don't want it to. This isn't a problem for most of the game, but some of the later levels that require you to chain hits on floating objects over a bottomless pit, or latch onto walls, change your direction mid-air, and then latch onto a perpendicular wall and then do it again, can become quite frustrating really quickly, especially if you haven't had a lot of time to practice maneuvers like this by attempting the time trials in earlier levels. And it's during moments like this where the cracks sort of begin to show. There are times when you'll go to latch onto a wall and pull yourself across a gap, but your aim will be ever so slightly off, and by the time you reach the other side, you'll just fall off the edge of a platform, or occasionally there will be an enemy that looks as though you can grab them, like the spiders on the walls here, but when you do, you get pulled toward them and fall down a bottomless pit instead. This sort of thing becomes less of a problem as the game goes on and you learn its mechanics through and through, but in the case of the enemies, the only way to know for sure which enemies you can pick up and which ones pull you toward them is to try it and see what happens, and then remember which is which as you play the game. Like, I can grab flies, but not spiders. I get pulled toward these big flies because they're fat, that makes sense, but then I get pulled toward this fish, but not these crocodile thingies, which are roughly the same size. Overall, it's not really that big of an issue, but it is something that's going to require a bit of trial and error on the part of the player, and it will almost certainly crop up over the course of a first playthrough. Another thing that takes some getting used to is Renata's jump height, which is pitifully short compared to other 3D platformers. This isn't really a problem with the game so much as it is with my many years of muscle memory for 3D platformers, as compared to other 3DP protagonists like Mario or Banjo-Kazooie, Renata can't jump for shit. Again, this has forced the developer as well as the player to fully utilize the Frogun mechanic, but I personally died a lot during my first couple of hours, simply because I thought I could jump higher and farther than you actually can. The camera can be an issue from time to time as well. Something about the design of each level combined with the graphical style and the almost top-down angle you'll be viewing the majority of the game through can sometimes lead to this sort of mismatch that can make it hard to tell at a glance the relational distance between different platforms. It's kind of like you're viewing an MC Escher drawing where it looks like you could be standing on one thing, but you're actually standing on this other thing over here. And occasionally this can lead to problems where you're trying to jump from one platform to the next, and it looks like you can make the gap, but nope, turns out that the platform is actually right next to you, but slightly higher up and not a short distance jump away. Then there are the bosses, which admittedly, I didn't care for at first. First and foremost, they're not really anything special in terms of design. If you've played a 3D platformer before, you've almost certainly seen a variation of every single boss present in Frogun. Bosses that bounce at you, bosses that swoop at you, bosses that cast spells, etc. And much like a lot of the other games in this genre, the bosses present here can only be hit at certain moments in their attack pattern, which is a style of boss that I've kind of been burnt out on for like 20 years now. With little exception, the bosses present in this game will attack you the exact same way every single time you fight them, and the challenge comes not from having to think on your feet, but memorizing their attack patterns, and once you do, they become very easy. The two later bosses, Hexy and Beelzebub, have enough variety and attack so frequently and with such speed that it takes a while before you get their patterns down, but again, they become trivial once you do. I do really like the character design of the bosses though. They're pretty interesting and very charming, and I like that each boss gets a little bit of character development as the game goes on, but overall they're nothing special and don't really add or detract from the overall experience. Though I do have to say that much like returning to earlier levels once you gain some experience with the Frogun, the boss rush and the brutal boss rush levels do sort of recontextualize these bosses as if they were designed for these gauntlet challenges rather than as part of the main game, game, because in the boss rush setting, fought one after the other, I actually found myself having a lot of fun with them. So while I don't think they're anything special, they get the job done and can be a fun challenge in the right context. Though I gotta say, that brutal boss rush level that mixes their movesets up and makes them just a little bit faster really tests the limits of this game's small pool of maneuvers, and was one hell of a challenge and became downright insane when I attempted to and finally completed this level without dying, so they're not completely without merit. And this brings me to the game's biggest flaw, that the Frogun mechanic, while fun and quite unique, might just be a little too difficult to master. You can really tell that this was a game that was made almost entirely by a single person, as much of the level design and challenges of the game, especially those found in later levels, sort of feel like they were created by a fan who had already mastered the game and wanted to challenge themselves rather than newcomers. This is one downside of making everything yourself that I'm personally quite familiar with, in that it's hard to gauge how other people are going to react to what you make. I'm sure that Molegato spent a lot of time tweaking the mechanic of the Frogun and adjusting the level design accordingly, but in the course of doing that, probably got really good at the game and started pushing the limits of what could be done with this mechanic. That's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, this leads to a game that has a lot of depth and replayability, but on the other hand, can turn off a lot of players before they even get the chance to see what makes this game so special. And based on a handful of reviews and comments I've read for this game, that seems to be the case, with a lot of players abandoning it a few hours in, saying that it starts out fun but then gets bullshit and frustrating, with many others, like myself, sticking with it until the end, labeling it as one of the best games of the year and one of the best 3D platformers of recent memory. Even after beating the main game, I still found myself struggling with the mechanics and dying constantly and missing a jump because the auto-aim couldn't be relied upon, and the extra levels after beating the final boss seemed downright impossible to me until I had banged my head against them a lot. While I do think that the game has a fairly linear difficulty progression, and the game does a fairly good job of teaching you and challenging you and then rewarding you for sticking with it, it does feature some pretty large difficulty spikes from level to level, to the point that this linear difficulty curve is less of a straight line and more like a set of stairs. Thankfully, the developer is tweaking a lot of things in response to player feedback, so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this has been fixed by the time this video goes live, and hopefully that's the case. Overall, Frogun is an excellent game that not only manages to act as a nice callback to a subset of the 3D platformer genre that hasn't been explored as much as its main branch, while also bringing a lot of new stuff to the table as well. So if you're looking for a challenging game to get your 3D platforming fix with, this is the one you want to play. Frogun, play it, or don't. Goodbye!